All right, welcome back. This is Unit 2 material, so we should be done with Unit 1 now. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, we have chemistry in Chapter 4. Don't freak out, this isn't intense chemistry. It should all make sense, and it's very relevant to everyday processes, particularly that you deal with in the healthcare field, things like ion balance and things like that, why there's saline in IV bags, things like that. So it makes sense. I will say I don't expect you to be reading the textbook, but if you are going to the textbook for extra help, just be careful. This chapter has a lot of extra information that we don't really need. So I don't expect you ever to memorize any chemical formulas or shapes. Just some simple rules and basic things that kind of describe our world, because our world is chemistry. That is what controls everything here. So that is how our bodies work. And yeah. So we're going to talk a lot about the molecules in cells, particularly what we call the biological macromolecules, things like lipids, sugars, stuff like that, the basic molecules of life. We'll talk a bit about how some pathogens actually kind of alter host biochemistry to cause disease. We have a very important example here that will actually come back to us several times in this course because it deals with a lot of principles. And then we'll talk about membranes. The cell membrane is really critical to life, and it can kind of regulate transport of molecules into and out of the cell, and it keeps things out. It tries to keep things like pathogens out. And then we'll talk about how pathogens can take advantage of these transport processes. So we'll talk a little chemistry. We'll talk how pathogens exploit that chemistry. We'll keep it real simple. So for chapter 4.1, we're going to start with a case study here. And we're going to talk a lot about a waterborne pathogen and how it causes disease at what we would call a mechanistic level. So what is the mechanism? How is the pathogen actually causing the disease? That does require us to understand a tiny bit of chemistry, but when I explain it, it should make sense from a conceptual level. So water is really necessary for life, right? We don't have any examples of living organisms that don't in some way use water. But too much water can be a bad thing, particularly when we look at human sanitation. So in the summer of 2010, heavy rains flooded Pakistan and about 1/5 of the country was submerged. So when that happens, that brings water into places where we don't want water, like into our village. But not just that, it brings things with the water into our clean water sources. And water contamination is a huge problem in flooding. So we have millions of people that are displaced, and because of this water contamination, we have microbial pathogens that are coming from sewage and things like that, or areas that are contaminated into our clean water systems. And basically, there are no clean water systems anymore. So a lot of the population becomes sick with diarrheal disease, and this really affects children because children are small. They only have so much water in them. And diarrheal disease, it basically causes watery stool, and you lose a lot of water, and it quickly leads to dehydration, which opens you up to other pathogens, but it can kill you in and of itself, right? If you don't have enough water, you die. So diarrhea, very simple, but very deadly. And it's difficult to treat when you don't have clean water. You have lots of water around you, but it's not clean. If you drink it, you just keep having more diarrhea because it's contaminated. And that diarrhea, where does it go? It goes back into the contaminated water, further contaminating it. Kind of a vicious cycle here. So in this study, we have a patient. He's 10 years old, named McCall. He has profuse diarrhea. He's seriously dehydrated, but we don't have clean drinking water available. So his diarrhea, when examined, it's watery and cloudy with basically white flecks of intestinal mucus. This is sometimes known as rice water stool. That's basically like you're having so much diarrhea that the lining of your intestine is coming with it. Sunken eyes, wrinkled skin, basically totally out of it from dehydration. So what's causing this? Well, in this case, we would take a stool sample, we take some of that diarrheal fluid, and we would use our microscope as we talked about in chapter 3. This doesn't sound very fun. There is a reason that I'm not a clinical microbiologist, and that's because you deal with a lot of body fluids, particularly poo. But it's very important to know what organisms in there. So the nurse observes bacteria swimming in there. When we stain them, they come up gram negative, and they're kind of these comma curve-shaped bacilli. So that tells us something. If you know clinical microbiology, you would instantly be thinking cholera. So you can do further tests, and that confirms Vibrio cholera, which is the cause of cholera disease, which is a diarrheal disease, and it's spread by contaminated water. Now, these bacteria make a toxin. This is pretty common, right? We've seen that with other pathogens. We saw our Clostridium botulinum. They made botulism toxin. This toxin, though, affects the intestinal chemistry. It actually causes the cells in the intestines to secrete or get rid of large amounts of chloride ions. So we'll talk about what an ion is in a moment, but it's basically a part of a salt, and your cells start to secrete that into the intestinal space. And what happens with that is because the chloride ion is negatively charged, it pulls positively charged sodium ions out with it. And that forms NaCl, which is salt, our table salt, in the intestinal area. Now, that salt is going to draw water out of the intestinal cells. That brings all the water into the intestinal lumen, the space inside the intestines, and that leads to diarrhea. That's where all the water is coming from. So it is literally making salt, sucking the water out of your cells, dehydrating you, and causing diarrhea. So you're losing all that water. And that benefits the pathogen because those Vibrio cholera go out in the diarrhea and further spread to more individuals. So without treatment, this child's chance of death is 50%. That's crazy, right? From diarrhea. We wouldn't think that would be possible, but that's a sad fact, right? A lot of people die from diarrheal disease. So if we just give someone that's having this happen to them more water, it doesn't go back into the cell because those ions are being secreted, right? That salt is going into the middle of the intestines. That water, if we just give them, even if we gave them clean water, it wouldn't go into the cells. It would be drawn into the intestines and cause more diarrhea. So we have to use a different type of treatment, and this is called oral rehydration therapy. How it works is we have basically a sugary, salty mix that we feed to the patient. Those sugars and those salts, they go into the cells in the intestines. They replace all those ions that got pulled out, and that draws water back into the cells. So this balance of ions, right, is really critical. And our cells are always balancing ions. You've probably heard of like electrolytes. Athletes need to replenish their electrolytes as they sweat, right? The salt comes out, and we need those salts for many processes. One, retaining water. Two, nerves need them, all kinds of things. So this oral rehydration therapy, we feed them salt and sugar. It goes into the cells, pulls clean water back into the cells. So within hours, he's becoming rehydrated. His flesh really is becoming firm again. And in just a week, he'll make a full recovery. So you can't just give water. You have to give this oral rehydration therapy when you are severely dehydrated. So I've talked about ions. I talked about a toxin. What's actually happening? So this is what we would call a mechanism, and we're not going to do too many of these, but these are fascinating, particularly to me. I love proteins and DNA and the way cells work and things like that, but it's really critical to know these things, to know how to treat disease properly. And it's really simple. What happens is we have this toxin. This toxin is a protein that's made by the bacteria, Vibrio cholera. This toxin gets secreted by the bacteria, and here's an intestinal cell. So on this side here in this blank space would be the intestinal lumen, right? Your intestines are a tube that are surrounded by cells, and this would be the hollow space in the middle. These cells have these little protrusions on them called villi that increase the surface area so you can absorb nutrients normally. But in this case, that toxin, it binds to the cell, and it binds to a receptor on the cell and tricks its way in. It looks like something that should come into the cell. We really don't want it, but that's how the bacteria has evolved this process. So it causes this to be brought in by a process that we call endocytosis, which means that some of the cell membrane basically surrounds this and pulls it in this little vacuole here. This toxin, once it's inside the cell, gets released and it goes over to what we call the endoplasmic reticulum. This is getting a little detailed, but it basically causes proteins to be secreted. So it's tricking the cell into releasing these proteins that activate some pumps. These pumps pump that chloride ion out. And that chloride ion is negatively charged. Negative attracts positive, right? So sodium and potassium get pulled out as well, forming salts, NaCl. And that pulls the water out, okay? So this high concentration of salt in the intestinal lumen pulls the water out. And that water comes out of the cell and then goes out of the body as diarrhea. We'll talk about the processes behind this. We'll talk about what an ion is specifically. We'll talk about osmosis, which is a process that's happening here. We'll talk about diffusion and transport, which are happening here. But I want to ground you in all these things, right? This chemistry can literally kill you. So it is important to know what's happening here because the treatment relies on chemistry as well, replacing these ions here to bring the water back in, okay? If you don't understand that and you give someone with diarrheal disease more water, it just exacerbates the problem. Okay, so 4.1, we're going to start with the basics, right? Elements, a little bit of how bonds are formed, and talk about some properties of water that make it important. We'll talk about the atoms that form most of the molecules of life. There's a small set of atoms that are found in almost all our biomolecules, we call them. We'll talk about the types of bonds atoms can form. These are actually important to the properties of things. And then we'll talk about water and the things that make it special. And then how other molecules interact with water. We have these two terms, hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Some things dissolve in water, other things don't, right? So at its core, living cells are made up of atoms, right? Which are our smallest units of matter, we call them. Really, there are subatomic particles, right? We have protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and then electrons buzzing around them. We're not going to get into too much about these. We will talk a little bit about electrons. Electrons can move between atoms, and that's really critical because electrons are kind of like a form of energy. So we'll see that when we talk about metabolism. When we talk about an atom, each atom has a specific number of protons and electrons. The neutrons can vary in isotopes. We're not going to talk about that, but like carbon has 6 protons and 6 electrons. An element is a pure form of just one single atom type. So a bunch of carbons together in like a diamond would be an element. These elements, right, they're just the pure form. Normally, we're seeing molecules, which I'll define in a moment. But the majority of living organisms, 98% of our mass, is made up of a couple of elements: hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and of course, carbon, right? We are carbon-based life forms. Carbon's really critical because of some cool properties about it. So I don't really want you to memorize any of this. I just want to illustrate that sometimes some types of atoms want to bond with other ones. They want to form chemical connections. Carbon's a really special one. It has this property called it has 4 valence electrons, and it can accept 4 more. So carbon can form a ton of different types of connections or bonds with other molecules, with hydrogens, with nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, all kinds of things. And this property makes carbon very flexible. It can do lots of different types of chemical reactions. You might be familiar with CH4, so a carbon with 4 hydrogens attached to it. That is methane or natural gas. You can burn that for energy. You also might be familiar with ethanol, which has several carbons bonded together, 2 in fact, and some hydrogens, oxygen, another hydrogen bonded to it. That is ethyl alcohol, the drinking alcohol, if you were so persuaded. But that also has other properties, right? You can burn that for energy. And we'll talk about the properties of organic molecules that make them so good at storing energy in just a moment. So what is a molecule? Well, a molecule is a combination of different atoms. A compound is a type of molecule that contains at least 2 different elements. Okay, so down here is a caffeine molecule. It is a compound because it has oxygen. These points are shorthand for carbons here. It's got nitrogens, hydrogens out here, and oxygen over here, right? So it's made up of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen. This would be an example of an organic compound. So again, this is the chemical definition of organic. Organic means it has at least a carbon and a hydrogen, but in almost all cases, that means it has a carbon-carbon bond, where one carbon is bonded to another carbon. Of course, something like methane, CH4, is just carbon and hydrogen, but that's like the simplest organic molecule we can get. So in most cases, they have lots of carbons bound together. Biomolecules are organic compounds that are found in cells and organisms. So there are organic compounds like petroleum, right? The oil we drill out of the ground. That is technically organic, but it is not a biomolecule per se. It's changed underground to become petroleum oil. Whereas it originally came from different biomolecules, but heat and pressure in the center of the earth and things like that changed it. So it's not just about what's in here. Chemistry is also a lot about shape. The order and shape of this molecule defines its properties. That is sometimes why people get confused with chemistry. The same thing that makes up water, hydrogen and oxygen, also makes up hydrogen peroxide, which just has one extra oxygen. One of those will kill you, one of those will keep you alive, right? So chemistry, right? The properties are super dependent on the shape and the arrangement and what's in there. So it's not like one element is just bad for you, right? It's the arrangement of elements that make them good or bad. Now, I've talked about chemical bonds. These are different attachments of atoms. And there's different types that have different strengths to them. We're going to cover them at a super basic level because there is importance here in understanding what kind of bond is there, because that's going to tell us how things are going to act with one another. So a covalent bond is our strongest bond, and this contains a lot of energy. You can think of chemical bonds, these little basically dashes in this formula, as stored energy. This is methane, right? If you light methane on fire, it burns and it breaks these chemical bonds here. So methane's really good at storing this energy in these bonds. And it stores them as covalent bonds, which is where 2 atoms share electrons. So hydrogen has 1 electron that it can share, and carbon has 4. So if we have 4 hydrogens, each with 1 to share, it can share 4 with the carbon. That makes our methane. Oxygen can share 2 electrons, so it can share with 2 hydrogens, and that makes H2O, which is water, right? We'll see how water is very special in just a moment. So these covalent bonds are really strong and super energy dense. There's a different type of bond called an ionic bond. So I talked about ions in the cholera example. Here, electrons are transferred from one atom to another. They're not shared, they're transferred. And that changes the charge on it. It makes it either positive or negative. So electrons are negative by their nature. So if something loses an electron, like sodium can lose this one extra electron, it becomes what we call positively charged, right? Lose a negative, you become positive. This would be a sodium ion. That positive charge on it makes it an ion. If you gain an electron, you become what's called an anion, and you have a negative charge like this chloride. So, as you know, positive and negative will attract to one another, just like in magnets, right? Chlorine and sodium will attract one another and form this kind of lattice-like structure, which we call a crystal. And this is salt, NaCl, like your table salt. That's why table salt is grains of little crystals, because of this ionic attraction. So this sodium attracting this chloride is called an ionic bond. These aren't quite as strong as the covalent ones, and they interact with water in some interesting ways. Ions have really important functions in the body, right? As we talked about, many are electrolytes. Sodium is important in the bloodstream. It can regulate your blood pressure. If you have too much of certain ions in you, they can form crystals, and those could be things like kidney stones. That's literally ions crystallizing inside of your kidney, forming these painful, literally stones, basically. So things like kidney stones, bladder stones, gallstones, gout, these are all ionic diseases, basically, where ions crystallize and form these things that irritate your body. Okay, I said water is special. Water's really special. Water forms what we call a polar covalent bond, and it shares electrons between the hydrogens and the oxygen. But oxygen is really big and hydrogen is really small. Hydrogen is just one proton. Oxygen has a lot more protons. So it actually pulls the shared electrons a little bit closer to it. It's kind of a hog, right? It hogs the electrons around it. And that gives it a slight negative charge, and these hydrogens a slight positive charge. When you have two water molecules together, the negative oxygen will attract a positive hydrogen and form a third type of bond called a hydrogen bond. Now, this is a pretty weak bond. Okay, hydrogen bonds are pretty weak on their own, but water, when you get lots of water molecules together, this will form a hydrogen bond, this will form a hydrogen bond, this will form a hydrogen bond. It forms tons of these bonds, and as we build more and more together, right, it's like leafing pages in a book together. If you have two pages stacked on top of each other, you can pull them apart. But if you like interleave all the pages of two books, the friction causes it to stick together. It's kind of the same thing here. These hydrogen bonds, when you have lots of them, are so strong that it causes what we know as surface tension, right? That's what causes water to bead up. And that's why, like, water strider bugs can literally walk on the surface of water because of these hydrogen bonds. These hydrogen bonds play critical roles in our DNA, in literally holding our DNA together. So we'll come back to them later in the course. Now, because water has this property, some things can dissolve in water, whereas other things can't dissolve in water. We call those polar substances and non-polar substances. Something that is polar, like a water molecule, we call it hydrophilic, or water-loving, right? Hydro means water, philic means loving. If you are a bibliophile, you love books. Hydrophilic means you love water. In the case of atoms or molecules, that means they will dissolve in water. So when you take your table salt, your NaCl, and add water to it, what happens? It dissolves into the water. That's because the ions come out of this crystal have attractions with this water molecule. Okay, so that's hydrophilic substances. Things like sugar, right, dissolve well in water. Salts dissolve well in water. But there are some things that do not dissolve in water at all. Think oil and water, right? They don't mix. That's because oil is something that we call a non-polar substance. It won't dissolve in water, so we call it hydrophobic, right? Hydro water, phobic fearing, right? It doesn't like water. And what happens here is we have these long, what we call hydrocarbons, those think oil, they don't want to interact with that water. So they'll clump up together. That's why when you have oil and water, right, the oil like sticks together and clumps together because it's hydrophobic. Okay, these these properties might not seem like they're important, but salts dissolving was super critical, right? And how they interact with water in that cholera example. Those salts coming out of the cell into the intestines, they pulled water with them. And that water then got expelled as diarrhea, right? So these properties are important. We will come back to them. There is a fourth final type of bond that's a little weird to understand. We're not going to talk about the physical basis of it. We're just going to know that it's called hydrophobic forces. Some examples of this are gecko feet. So geckos can actually walk up glass because of these tons of these very weak hydrophobic forces allow the gecko to walk up the glass. You might be familiar with this with command strips. These are like, I love them, I hate them, right? They stick by these hydrophobic forces, but you have to push them on and let them sit there for a while. And if you don't put enough on, your picture frame falls down in the middle of the night and freaks you out, right? But these work on hydrophobic forces. They're a lot of very weak interactions all building together to form a strong type of force. So those are our four types of bonds, right? We have covalent, those are the strongest. Then we have ionic, those are strong. Then we have hydrogen bonds, those are weak, but when we have lots of them, they're strong. Finally, we have hydrophobic forces, which we're not going to talk too much about. Okay, so we have our major atoms of life. They're carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those atoms can form bonds, right? We have our strong and our weak. I want you to think of chemical bonds not as some complex thing, but they store energy, right? When you make a bond, it requires energy. When you break a bond, it releases energy. And that's how our bodies work, right? We eat sugar, glucose or something like that. It's got carbons in it with bonds. Our metabolism breaks those bonds, releasing energy that powers us, right? So that's as deep as we need to go with that. Water is our what we call solvent of life. Water is really great as a solvent. It can dissolve many things. That's what a solvent means. And it's one of the most prevalent molecules in living organisms. These hydrogen bonds allow it to dissolve things, which is really important. Those molecules can be polar. They will dissolve or be hydrophilic, whereas nonpolar molecules, they tend to be hydrophobic, less soluble or insoluble in water. So this matters when we talk about membranes. Our membranes will have molecules that don't like water and do like water and will allow certain things in and certain things not in. So this hydrophobic, hydrophilic will come back to us in just a moment. Okay, that's it for 4.1.